objective moral values exist, and we're starting right now.
It's showtime.
Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here. This is going to be a lot of fun. We haven't gotten to do this topic in a long time. So, epic. We've got two very seasoned speakers on here today with us, joining us, which is a pleasure to have them. And we want to say their links are both in the description. So if you're like, I like what I'm hearing, you can check out more at their links in the description. So, also, if this is your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button as we're trying to build an eclectic community, whether they be Christian, atheist, Republican, Democrat, Jedi, and even Sith. So with that, want to mention as well, we have just started doing our Patreon for the first time ever. We just want to say we are going to totally change the way we started. I basically modeled it off of a few channels that I had seen, and someone was like, hey, here's a good way to improve it. And I'm like, that is way awesome. So basically, long story short, we're going to bring it down to like a $5 monthly tier and a $10. We're going to get rid of those like bigger ones. Like, who needs them? So excited about that. And I want to mention, this week, we had Tom on just last night. It was a lot of fun. We love Tom, and we are hosting his debate on whether or not belief in God is reasonable. It's our first in-person debate that we are hosting at Modern Day Debate. So we are thrilled for that one. We hope you can make it. It's in central Wisconsin. If you happen to live in Wisconsin, we'd love for you to make the drive, but if you don't, it'll be live streamed here at Modern Day Debate, so you'll still be able to see it. And with that, we're going to introduce our speakers. I want to let you know that, as I mentioned, these have both been on before. These speakers are both experienced both on this channel and other channels. Dr. SJ has been on numerous times for a lot of debates, usually regarding ethics. It's always been a pleasure to have you, SJ. We really appreciate you coming.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
You bet. And then Negation of P, who we've actually had the honor of having him as well before. And want to mention, he is part of the old guard, you could say, of YouTube. Like back in the days of like Potholer and like Shock of God, like all these older YouTube channels. He's been around, he's seen it all, so we were thrilled to have both of our speakers. Both of them have a really unique background. With that, this is open discussion. I think most people prefer that. So I'm going to basically just let the speakers define exactly what they mean by the question. And Dr. SJ, if you're okay with going first, we usually have the affirmative kind of, by going first, I'm not talking about like a statement, but just in terms of opening up the conversation of what you mean when you say yes to the question of whether or not we do have objective moral values and duties. So thanks again for being here, both of you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me again, and thank you for letting me go first. I'll just cite my case is rather short. It's the idea of first looking at what are objective moral values and duties. And so these are duties and values that are not subject to the opinions of people. So they're not subject to change based on the opinions of people or the opinions of cultures or the opinions of generations. They actually transcend generations. And so I posit that if objective moral values and duties exist, then a transcendent and righteous moral lawgiver must exist. And yes, I'm losing my thing. Universal and objective moral values and duties do exist. I have numerous papers and research to back that up. Therefore, an objective moral lawgiver must exist. So that's my basic case. And so I just go from there, and I can provide the studies. I've actually printed out one of my chapters from my book that I've been working on for quite a while right now. And in this chapter, I've got a lot of information on our objective moral values and duties. So I look forward to chatting with Ned tonight about this subject. So thank you.
Okay, I didn't know if James is going to come back. Thanks everybody for being here, and thank you, SJ. And of course, I am going to argue the negative in that no, I do not believe there is any universal or objective moral standards. For a while, I was on the fence, but I've had a few people convince me that the way that I was using some conditions were still subjective in that it would not universally apply. So that's pretty much where I'd like to start. I mean, I think there's no point in me digging into this too much. I think everybody understands where I'm at. I don't know how we want to do this, SJ. If you want to start asking me, or I can ask you. I guess the only thing I would like to know is when you define universal, kind of expand on that for me, so I know exactly what you mean. And I hate to be semantic about it, but it's kind of important in my opinion.
I would say that they apply to everyone.
Okay, that's perfect. That's exactly what I was hoping, and that's what I think everybody would agree with that. So
Okay. Okay, so I'll just point out, I've pointed out a lot of these same studies before, so I don't want to be redundant and point to the same ones that I usually point to, but I will make a mention of them really quickly before I go to some other studies. But I have studies from, for example, Kinnear, Kearns, and Doutharibes in 2000 and 2007. They noted when they looked at the 7 major world religions, along with atheism and humanism and the United Nations, they found that all of them had the same 4 core values. One of them is a commitment to something greater than oneself. One is self-respect, but with humility, self-discipline, and acceptance of personal responsibility. A third one is respect and caring for others, such as the Golden Rule, which is how Christianity plays that out. And the fourth is caring for other living things in the environment. Another study by Dalsgaard, Peterson, and Seligman in 2005 was very similar. They also looked at those same groupings, but they actually didn't look at atheism. Instead, they added Athenian philosophy. So they went back to some of the works of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and they found 6 recurrent values: courage, temperance, justice, transcendence, humanity, and wisdom. And they actually analyzed these different religions, the major world religions, along with that in the ancient texts. So they looked at the ancient texts and they found that we also share that. And then there are other studies. For example, Schwartz in 2012 indicated that no matter what the culture was, and he had surveyed thousands of people across many cultures in the world, he found no matter what the culture is, everyone knew that benevolence basically was recognized as the #1 moral duty. So we ought to be benevolent, followed by universalism, which is the idea that we also care for the outgroups. And then it was also followed by the idea of self-direction. So we take care of ourselves. And I have a number of other studies that basically point to the same sorts of things. So the bottom line from a lot of these studies is that we do have these universal moral duties. They've been around for a long time. Some might say that evolution is something that can explain that, but I have no reason to say that evolution doesn't offer a partial explanation of what I call as our descriptive values. And of course, we have heritable traits, and studies such as the one by Illes in 2006 in the Journal of Organizational Behavior identified a number of heritable traits, things such as agreeableness and conscientiousness. And they basically said that less than half of our behaviors can be explained by these heritable traits. We're likely to inherit stuff from our parents, but less than half of that is explained genetically. Cy Gart, who's a scientist everyone knows here probably, but Cy had pointed out that actually takes the case away from evolution as being a great explanation of our morality. So I look at this little picture that I made. I don't know if you can see that very well. If you can see this idea, see this? Okay, so this is a very similar picture that I've seen in neuroscience studies, because I do a lot on learning and education, and I go around and I teach experiential education to a number of educators around the country. And I just got back from Orlando. One of the studies that we reference often and recently is this study that points to the way people learn. So you start off with, some basic ideas, and as you grow older, you build from these ideas and it goes up. What's interesting is it's very similar to evolution, because if you look at our social evolution over the centuries, and if we go back to the time of the Roman Empire, people were really pretty awful back then. People were putting their babies in the streets and doing all sorts of bad things. Women weren't given very many rights. They were considered not as valuable, or their testimonies weren't as valuable as men's. But since Christianity came about, our evolution and our social evolution has become better and better and better as we try to strive for this goalpost. And I would say that the goalpost was what Jesus has said. So our ideal in my moral framework is Jesus Christ.
Okay. I guess a couple of questions to that fact. I mean, if we're looking at a universal, goodness, if you want to put it that way, there are oughts out there, and those oughts are unchanging, like you said, and they're applicable across any and all demographics, regardless of who the person is. Are there some, I would think there would be some things that should universally be looked at as wrong, as not not something advantageous in any way, shape, or form. Things like genocide, to use, let's say Matt Slick, which I I don't know if you know my history with Mr. Slick, but anyway, his deal about harming children and that type of thing. I guess the thing that jumps out to me is if we're going to apply this universally, then I'm not understanding how genocide, we give a pass to God, and harming children, and all the suffering that has directly been caused by his hand alone, just let alone in the Old Testament.
So actually, and you're bringing up a really good point. I want to just, before we go into the idea of looking at these very bad things, there have been studies that have indicated that, of course, we do universally realize that murder and theft and things like that are wrong. So I just found a new study that indicated that not too long ago. I've got it.
Well, SJ, just before we get past that point, I don't think all of us do. I mean, I think that there's plenty of evidence out there that there are people who do not think along those lines. Non-empathetic people do exist. Most of the times we call them sociopath or psychopath. But if we know that we have outliers on either end, I think that it's a fairly strong indication that all of us live on a sliding scale, and most of us fall somewhere close to the norm, and would agree that those things are bad. But there are people out there that absolutely do not care or think either of those things are wrong.
So first let me point out to the source of the study I had mentioned that talked about the idea. This particular study it's an old one. It's from West Marek in 1906, and he basically surveyed using research from psychological, ethnographical, historical, and theological sources. And he basically said that evolved moral emotions and similarities of human nature make prohibition of homicide and theft and approval of charity, generosity, mutual aid, and honesty universal. So this was just one study that said that. So if you go back to the idea of psychopathy or sociopaths, actually what they found recently about psychopaths and sociopaths is not that they don't realize what they're doing is wrong. They do know what they're doing is wrong. They just don't care. So
again, if we're going to go down the moral path, and I think that you'd be hard pressed to get there without basing it in empathy. And not to mention that if it is universal, again, we have, and granting that God exists, we have a God that specifically engages in every one of those actions. And I mean, I've got scripture if you want to go that way, but I don't see how you can get a universal truth, quote unquote, and not take into account that there are, I mean, the case studies that you're going to, and again, I don't want to get too much in that. I think Nick Lamar in your previous debate here did a fairly good job of kind of answering those questions. That's why I tend to stay away from the studies in this debate. We just want to have kind of, or not even a debate, just have a discussion with you. But anybody that's watching, I would suggest going back and looking at that previous debate, just because he did address, I would say, vast majority, if not every point that you made. But again, I don't see how you hand wave
Wait, let me address that point real fast before you go to another one. So I'd like to address the Nick debate. I haven't had a debate since I was in the debate with Nick. There were several things that occurred in that debate. One was I didn't have the studies right in front of me because I didn't have my original computer where I actually wrote the blog using those studies. And so I wasn't able to reference them during the debate. So I didn't have that convenience. Nick was choosing certain lines out of the studies, but he was not looking at just the basic overall message. So what I did, just to show, actually, let me tell you what I did. And I've actually posted it just today on my Twitter feed. So what I did was I actually went back to the meta-analytic studies and I posted the exact worded abstracts from every single one of the meta-analytic studies, because what abstracts do in academic studies is they share the information about the purpose of the study and the results of the study. And so the abstracts were able to show that my case was actually solid. And so Nick wanted to make the case that extrinsic religiosity does not have some benefits. And actually, I agree with him.
Right.
The type of religiosity that has benefits to our health is intrinsic religiosity. Extrinsic religiosity is people who are very surface level believers, and they really like the idea of a community and that sort of thing with the church. But it's kind of like when Jesus talked about the seeds that were being planted on the rocky path. When the hard times come, the extrinsic religious people walk away. And it's unlike the ones who are planted in firm soil, which is the intrinsic religious believers. And the intrinsic one basically have a much deeper, more solid relationship with God, very similar to several passages in the Bible where you see these people who, despite hardships, are able to overcome them and maintain their faith to God. And so that's the type of religiosity that has the health benefits.
Well, and again, I think Nick made it. Again, I don't want to debate yours in Nick's debate. I think that stands on its own. You guys can go see it. I would also hope that you would not only post the abstract, but also the conclusion to each one of those studies, as well as.
Well, the abstract includes the conclusions, I should add.
Well, I'm saying, I understand, but what I'm saying is if we can get all the way, again, I'm an educator as well. In fact, I teach that, like you, I teach college level, and I'm fairly well versed in I guess scientific methodology and studies. I would tend to side with Nick on that. While there may be correlation, there's nothing showing causation, and until you can bridge.
Thank you. And I never actually said that correlation and cause. I never said it was causation. In fact,
Right.
I tried to tell Nick several times during that study that I wasn't saying anything that was causal. I was talking about correlations the entire time.
Right, but if you're only looking at correlation, that does not allow you to. Again, I didn't want to get down this road. This is one thing I really wanted to avoid because, again, y'all's debate is y'all's debate. So I would allow. Let's let the audience go there, and let's try to get back to where we're going, if you don't mind. I definitely.
Excellent. That's good. Because I didn't come tonight to talk about the health benefits of religiosity or intrinsic religiosity. I certainly will, though, if you want to. But no, I'd much rather talk about morality, where we were supposed to be.
So let's go back, and my first question is if we are, again, let's say that I do grant, and I would like to steelman you, in that let's say that I grant there is universal truths, there is universal right and wrong. Would you say that genocide is a right or a wrong?
I would say that genocide is wrong.
Okay, and God commits genocide multiple times, not the least of which wiping out every human being on the planet save 8.
Genocide is ethnic cleansing. God did not commit ethnic cleansing.
So the Amalekites were not ethnically cleansed, or at least attempted to be.
I'm not going to go through the Old Testament, because actually the reason I'm a Christian is because I adhere to that Jesus fulfilled the law and the prophets. And Jesus,
But again,
when Jesus came, he basically gave us 2 commandments. So we're to love our neighbors as ourselves. And even beyond that, even more importantly, is to love God above all else.
But again, SJ, what we're talking about is a universal truth. It is non-changing. That's exactly your words that you used. Therefore, if it was wrong in the Old Testament, it can't now be right in the New, or vice versa. So the problem is we have multiple examples of God demanding his people wipe out entire civilizations, and by his own hand doing it.
Are you going to live forever, Ned?
According to scripture, I might.
Really?
I mean, again, well, I mean,
so you're going to live forever. If you have children, are your children going to live forever?
Well, let's be
on this planet.
Okay, on this planet, probably not.
Okay,
But,
so would you say, is it fair to say that of the 108 billion people who've walked this planet, let's also note that 57% of them have walked since the year 1 AD, according to the Population Reference Bureau.
right.
Of the 108 billion people who've walked this planet and who lived over 100 years ago, how many of, or 100, let's say 115 years ago, how many of them are alive right now?
Well, let's say that it's 0.000, and I don't know, tack how many zeros you want to on that. 1%.
Okay, so,
Would
you say it's fair? Let me ask you a question.
Wait, let me finish. How does that speak to the ethical right or wrongness of genocide.
I'm trying to explain to
Okay,
you
sorry.
exactly. So see, God sets the timing of our deaths, and he sets the means for our deaths, and he uses our lives to basically to make this world a better place. And as you can see, the world has become a better place ever since, especially since Jesus started walking the earth. Because since Jesus walked the earth, we've noticed that now women are have the same rights as men. Women are being educated all over the world. In fact, it's about a very small percentage difference right now between the number of men educated in the world and the number of women educated in the world. And that speaks to Western values and Christianity. It's done an amazing job of influencing our universities. In fact, many of the Ivy League universities were started because of Christians. And it's also influenced our healthcare system because Christians played a vital role back in the Roman Empire of setting up healthcare for everyone, not just the soldiers. So Christianity has really changed things for the better. And what's beautiful about that is that God has done that. Since he sent Jesus down, we've made some very positive improvements in our social development. So we can thank God and we can thank Jesus especially.
And the Nazis, as horrific and absolutely monstrous as that civilization, if you want to grant it that, were, you cannot deny that there were certain goods that came from it. Now, again, it doesn't speak to the absoluteness in which we're talking about today. If we're looking at, and again, if you'd like to change and say, I mean, I don't see how we let God off the hook for genocide, but let's move on. If we're going to start branching out and trying to see any good that came from anything, well, we can look at the Manson murders. We can look at there's a series on Netflix right now that I've been watching, Mind Hunters, that showed how all of these serial killers, because of being incarcerated and being interviewed by the FBI, that allowed us to profile and find new means to cut off serial killers before they got, let's say, too far down the line. So you could argue that those serial killers served a good at that point. But again, it doesn't change the fact that I think both of us would agree that the ones, especially the ones that are harming children, were not acting in a good way. So, and again,
You're right. I think that you and I and probably anyone else on the planet could agree that torturing babies for fun is something that's morally, objectively wrong. Would you agree to that?
I would, but I don't think your God would.
Why don't you think my God would? When Jesus came down, he said again, let's repeat this. He said, love the Lord above all else. And the Lord is love. It's also said that in the Bible. And he said, and love your neighbors as yourselves. Would torturing a baby be loving your neighbors as yourself?
Well, again, I'm assuming that you feel that God, the God of the Old Testament, and Jesus are at least of one of the Trinity. They're one personhood or one entity wrapped up in potentially three personhoods. So again, when God goes, let's say, we can go through a bunch of them. When you talk about Isaiah 13, where God specifically orders that these children be dashed to pieces upon the rocks, and the people rejoice as they're doing it. When God himself takes David's baby in 2 Samuel and harms that baby infects that baby, and the baby, I'm not going to go as far as say suffer because I don't know, but at least became ill, because that's what scripture tells us, for 7 days, was ill for 7 days and then passed on. This is all for God's glory. This is all for God's plan. So those children, and again, God seems to like dashing babies upon rocks and cutting them out of the woman's womb, because he says that in multiple times throughout the Old Testament. So again, you're absolutely right in that I would say, from my subjective point of view, that no, that was not right. But again, your God not only apparently approves of it, but takes part and specifically does it on his own. So yeah,
Can you give me the specific verse in Isaiah 13 where it says that God is dashing babies onto rocks?
No, God is commanding his people to dash dash them onto rocks. Let me grab and make
Yeah,
sure.
just grab me that verse so I can just see that. And the other ones I'm more aware of, but I don't recall Isaiah 13, God saying he's going to tell people to dash babies on rocks. So I'm going to look for that. Because I realize a lot of people like to refer to Psalm 139, which actually is talking about people lamenting the situation that they were in captivity and their captors were dashing babies on rocks and they were lamenting it and basically crying about it. So a lot of people use that particular, it's either 137 or 139 to try to make that claim, but it's actually not just.
This is Isaiah 13, 14 through 16, and I can read it verbatim. I don't know if I'm using the same Bible as you, but speaking about all and any non-Israelites, everyone that is found shall be thrust through, and everyone that is joined unto them shall fall by the sword. Their children also shall be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses shall be spoiled, and their wives ravished. So, and that's 16. That's Isaiah 13, 16 specifically. So in that, God is directing not only that the children are dashed to pieces, but the children, I would assume that you would agree, ravished means raped. I think any of those actions there, if it was non-directed by God, any of us would consider that to be, let's say, less than a universal good, and that's where I'm having a disconnect here.
Well, and one of the things that you're doing tonight, which I'm so used to because it seems to be an old atheist philosophy, is let's keep going back to the Old Testament and trying to find out why these issues happen in the Old Testament. Let's ignore her calls to focus on Jesus because clearly we don't want to focus on Jesus because Jesus mentioned to us that we should love our neighbors as ourselves, and that's those things I've already repeated twice. So you haven't mentioned anything from the New Testament, but anyway, let me just answer your question real fast. So if we look at the Old Testament, what the Old Testament does is essentially God identified a chosen people. He chose them to bring way for Jesus, to pave the path for Jesus. Many times there were people who were trying to stop them, and many times they also failed, and God punished them whenever they failed, and he made mention of that all throughout the Old Testament. And he also punished those who tried to kill the Jews, and he tried to deceive them and tried to get them to believe in their gods, like the god Molech, to which they worshipped and to which they sacrificed by burning their infants and their young children for the purpose of crops. And so many of the people who were taken down, such as the Babylonians, the Canaanites, and Assyrians, were also known as very evil people who did things such as human sacrifice and many other things. So they were doing a lot of that kind of stuff. And so what God did repeatedly through the Old Testament is he said, listen, I don't want you to sacrifice your babies to the gods Moloch. I don't want you worshiping other gods. He said, you can worship other gods. He made that really clear in Joshua 24:15, but he said, that's not what I want you to do. So God made that clear. But since you're bringing up the Old Testament, I think I'd like to share a couple of passages.
Can I speak to that, what you just said 1 second?
Well, yeah, let me just share a couple of passages from the Old Testament, since you want to talk so much about the Old Testament. And you did mention this in the previous chat. You talked about Jesus being part of, it's 3 in 1. There's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I was raised Catholic, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So I do believe that Jesus is mentioned many times in the Old Testament. In fact, in Daniel 9, if we look at 77s and we look at the year 444 BC with the decree of Artaxerxes, we actually see that if we add that up using 360-day calendar years, we end up with a date that's at the Sunday just before the Sunday, which is now Palm Sunday, which is just before Jesus' crucifixion. We actually end up at the date just before 4/3 of 33, which is really fantastic because that happens to be the day Jesus was crucified, and Daniel made mention of that when he referred to the Anointed One. We also know from Malachi 3:1 that the Anointed One is supposed to appear in the Second Temple before it was destroyed. Jesus appeared in the Second Temple. It was destroyed in 70. And then since you mentioned Isaiah, we know from Isaiah 52 and 53 how Jesus was going to be died. He was going to be pierced for our transgressions. And we also knew he'd see the light after that. And so he would be resurrected. We know from Psalm 22 also some of the means in which he was killed. So that I just want to mention, since you brought up the Old Testament, I thought I would also share those verses with the audience.
Okay, thank you. And again, I don't see how those are relevant to universal odds, but and again, I don't want to be too pointed, but when you bring up that the reason that God committed genocide, or the reason that he he did these things.
Number one, I didn't say he committed genocide. He might have had some people removed from their lands. He told the Canaanites, for example, he had them moved from their lands. He didn't commit genocide. So I don't agree with you on that.
All right. Do you agree that God killed David's baby?
I agree that God can kill. God, I had a miscarriage, so technically I could make the claim that God killed one of my babies. God is the one who sets the dates for us, and so some people have kids who die early. God is sovereign, and He's our creator, so we have to give Him the ability to choose the dates for us, and He does that to be able to make sure that this world is going to end up exactly how He wants it.
So that's exactly to my point. Is if you're going to explain these things away, you cannot then claim universalism, because if there are reasons, if there are events or causes that would in one instance make whatever you're saying is universally wrong now are right, it is no longer universal. And even if it's God that is acting, if it's God who is doing this and God is the only outlier, it is still not universal. If there is any instance in which these quote unquote universal wrongs become right, they're no longer universal. They're subjective, because what they're subject to is God's will now. If you're saying that they're objective and they're independent of mind, well, God's mind counts in mindhood, I would assume. Therefore, everything again becomes subjective and it cannot be universal.
So let me explain my take on that idea. So when I speak of universal and objective moral values, the idea is we have a lawgiver and we're the people who are supposed to follow the law. So of the 108 billion people who've walked the planet, all of us have a conscience, and we're all told that we should follow the law. And we're all essentially raised in a way that we should follow the law. We all happen to know that the golden rule is correct. We all happen to know that we should seek meaning and purpose. We all do look for higher values and higher purposes. So because we have all of that with all of our people, I would say that it is universal. It's universal to people. Now, God, as the creator and the moral lawgiver, has different qualities than us, and He's not subject to the same laws He created. God actually is concurrently in the past, present, and future. And given the fact that He's concurrently in the past, present, and future, He knows how the timing that He allows people to be on this planet before He moves them into a different location, onto heaven, especially with babies. Before He moves them onto heaven, He knows He gives us a certain amount of time on the planet. Some of us might have a couple of years, some of us might have 90 years. God sets those times. He's not subject to the laws as we are, because again, He can see the future unlike we can. And that's why I pointed to the prophecies in the Old Testament. Right. You were wondering why.
Well, I mean, as far as the prophecies go, that's neither here nor there, as far as what we're looking for from a moral standpoint. Again, if there's a reason that makes an action good, regardless what the driver, what the cause of that reason is, that would cause a universal wrong to become right. Let's say that God had to kill David's baby to bring about salvation. Let's say that if David's baby would have lived, Jesus could have never taken the cross and we could not have gained salvation.
That's possible.
Exactly. That wrong that God and everyone, and we just talked about this, torturing a baby for fun or for any reason is universally considered wrong. So that baby, taking that baby's life, that wrong resulted in the ultimate of all goods. And I mean, again, we can get back to
you're getting it. This is excellent. Thank you.
Wait a second. But the problem is just like we talked about, SJ, if we want to go down that road, then that gets to my gnome argument, which negates all morality. And I don't know if you still want to go down there. We could definitely go that road, because I'd love to hear your take on it. But
well, you brought up the Nazis before. I think that a good example, if we look at the idea of the baby that God took, and many babies that have been killed in the Bible, you could also bring up the flood and Noah and the babies that died in the drowning. You could bring up the babies who died in the Canaanite lands, who had chosen not to fled. They stayed with the babies didn't choose, but their parents chose to keep them there. You could bring up all kinds of babies through the Bible. The point is, how many babies were killed who might have been potential Hitlers? I mean, since you brought up the idea of Hitler and you brought up the idea of the Nazis, I could probably say that perhaps God has spared us many such Holocausts through the centuries by making sure that those babies didn't live long lives, because He knew their evil potential.
Which is exactly my point, SJ. You're calling for a universal, all-encompassing good. that mandates these laws that cannot, in any circumstance, be changed or be looked at from a different perspective. It has to always happen that we do not do this or we always do that. There is nothing that I have seen, including the things that, I mean, you have offered, from genocide to hurting babies to whatever, that there are not outliers out there that would make those good things, including, let's say that Hitler actually brought about the only way that we could get to nuclear power and get away from harming the planet, or because of Hitler, he stopped even a greater evil. And God used Hitler and that genocide that he committed to save the world. So again, just because we don't like whatever the action is, you can't say it's universally bad and then at the same time say, but God can do it. Because if anyone can do it, including God, that immediately makes it non-universal.
So you're making a statement that sounds rather absolute, but yet you don't believe in absolute value statements.
Absolute, okay, be careful. Not absolute, the absolute value statement.
You made a statement that said, if this is the case.
That's what I'm saying. The absolute value statement that I'm saying is there are no universal right and wrongs. Those
are you absolutely sure?
Okay, if we're going to play the precept argument, I can go that route.
That sounds like it's making a statement that there are no universal right or wrongs. That sounds like you're saying that that you're making a truth claim.
Again, SJ, moral right and wrongs. I'm pretty sure that I can demonstrably show you that anything from 2 plus 2 all the way up to calculus and how we derive, whatever we want to at that point. I'm pretty sure I can show you those are correct. And those are universal. And those are, without exception, non-changing. Whereas, so those universal truths are true. But again, just because I don't have to have everything being absolute doesn't mean I can't believe in some absolutes. But again, let's stick on topic and let's stay with our moral argument and not get off into the precept exploration of knowledge and epistemology, because that does not go too well. But we all know where that ends.
Okay, well, let's go back since do you listen to Jordan Peterson?
I listen to him every once in a while. There's some things I like and quite a bit more that I don't. But okay.
So one of the things that I like about Jordan Peterson is he actually identified a situation that he says that the universe, I'm just saying not the universe, anyone on this planet could look at what happened during the Holocaust in Auschwitz, where they basically rounded up Jewish people, told them they were finally going to get a shower. So they rounded up these skin and bones, told them they were finally going to get a shower, and then shoved them like sardines into the showers where they gassed them. And the Jewish people were screaming to death. And he also talked about sort of Sisyphean duties that they gave these starving Jewish people during the Holocaust. And of course, Hitler also picked on people who were handicapped and Catholics in a lot of cases, people who are of any undesirables. He considered undesirables and lesser people. So one of the things that I bring this up for is because Peterson made a pretty brilliant statement. He said, we could look at the evil that occurred in the Holocaust and shoving those people in showers and actually burning them to death through gassing. He said that we could objectively say that's morally wrong. And I think that you and I, and just about anyone we would ask who does not have a seared conscience, like those serial killers you mentioned, anyone you ask who doesn't have a seared conscience would agree with us that yes, that's objectively morally wrong.
Well, again, I don't think you can make that statement. Again, is it not possible that all of that was required to bring about God's plan and God's greater good? Is it not at least possible?
I think that God makes the best of a lot of situations. He looks at the evil, he understands that evil is going to occur, and he shapes it to make the best outcome that's possible. So he took the evil that occurred on the planet, he's taken the evil that's occurred, he's given us free will. And one good thing that did come out of the Holocaust was the idea that Israel was granted status as a nation in 1948. So Israel, which had been wiped off the planet in the year 70, suddenly gets nation status. There's no other nation in the world quite like that, but that's in fulfillment of what Daniel prophesied in the scriptures.
Okay, but again, and if we go back to Colossians, we can go to Psalms. God created everything through himself for himself. Let me make sure I'm not misreading. And again, I can go through my notes and get them. But there are plenty of places also. We know that all those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. That's Romans 8:28. Now, if that's the case, and we take that at face value, then those deaths and that exact circumstance that you just described has to be for the good. And you just spoke earlier on God knows the beginning from the end. He knows what's going to happen before he even set this universe alight, if you will. And therefore, again, we're getting really close to my argument in that if that is the case, you would have to start to wonder if those horrors, those things that we look at as evils, could in fact be good. And the same way that a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old going to get a flu inoculation or other shots that would keep him from getting polio and other things would not understand that the pain that he has to go through and the person approaching him with that needle is not evil, because he doesn't have the ability to foresee what could happen if he doesn't have that. We could be just as limited in God's perspective. And he needed to use the Holocaust. He needed to use all of these things to bring about his glory and his goodness. Again, that negates all bad. There is no good at this point. But again, I don't want to get in that unless you.
Well, I'd like to address those points.
Okay. Yeah, please.
So let me just see if I've got you correctly. Let me see. I'll steel man you. So you say, let me see if this thing, are you saying that God needed humans to be evil for him to be able to get good out of it?
What I'm saying is the concept of evil no longer has any real meaning. When you say,
okay, so you say there's no evil in the world, is that correct? Is that a correct statement?
If there's an omnibenevolent, omni-God, yes, evil does not make any sense whatsoever. The concept.
Okay, so let me just go back. So you're saying that if we were to view what happened during the Holocaust, you're saying that labeling that as evil isn't possible in a world that's God-driven.
What I would say is it would be limited on our perspective or it would be fallacious on from our perspective to, on one hand, believe a God has set a plan in motion. He is an omni-being. That means if he wants something to happen, it has to happen. In other words, if he doesn't want something to happen, it cannot happen. And therefore, everything that has taken place and will take place is due to God's plan and his will. And if we grant that God is all good, omnibenevolent, then apparently that was his only means to bring about the ultimate of all goodness. And because of our limited view, we can't see those bad things as good any more than a 5-year-old can see getting a shot as being good.
Okay, well, number one, I disagree with the idea that God needed us to do anything. God doesn't need us to do anything. God does use our actions to work for the greater good, but he didn't need us to commit the Holocaust, for example. That was absolutely not a need from God.
SJ, that's not what I said. So
okay.
let's parse that out. What I said is God created the Holocaust. He didn't.
No. Hitler created the Holocaust.
Again, did God create everything? Is that what our Bible tells us?
God created the world and he gave us free will. Hitler used his free will to go against God. In fact, throughout humanity, since you like the Bible so much, if you look at Romans 3:23, it says, for all fall short of the glory of God. We all sin. That's going against God's will. So yes, sometimes we do go against God's will. God's will is for us to be good. And actually, if you read the book of Matthew, you're going to notice and I hope you'll read this if you haven't read it yet, but if you read the Beatitudes and you just read the entire Sermon on the Mount, you're going to realize that a lot of people choose to go against God's will. God's will is for us to do the best, for us to get to heaven, and for us to love.
That's where we need. I think where we need to start, especially if we do want to go down this road. And again, I know that I sent you the video, and you seem to want to go to universal good instead of doing the argument. So if you're not comfortable doing that, I'm more than happy to redirect back to universal goodness. But if and I'll let you take it where you want to after this question. If you have an omni being, is there any way to thwart his will?
Is there any way to thwart God's will? No.
Okay.
There is a way to try to you probably remember the phrase with our Father who art in heaven, holy be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done.
Exactly.
And the thy will be done, as C.S. Lewis points out, is a couple of different meanings. So you could look at thy will be done, and that's the idea of yes, I'm going to follow you, God, thy will be done, or thy, as in me, will be done if I don't follow. So I like that multiple or dual use of that particular phrase from our Father. I think it's very intense.
So what I want to make sure that we're clear on, you said we cannot thwart God's will. And again, correct me if I'm wrong here. And God knows our actions from cradle to grave and even before and after, correct?
True.
Effectively, if God knows what we're going to do, we cannot stray from God's path. We cannot do anything against an omni being unless he allows it, which then means he wanted it to happen in the first place. So I'm very confused to how, if that's what you're saying, how you can now claim that somehow us, and again, I'm not, it may sound a little sarcastic, but I don't mean it this way. Us lowly humans could transgress against an omni. I don't see how we could ever break that bond.
Okay, so I think there might be a misconception on your part in your understanding of what God is. So in the Christian faith, we believe that God is both immanent, that means he's in this world, he's also transcendent to the world. He's concurrently in our past, present, future. So he's actually already seen your entire life played out. He knows what you're going to do because he's already seen you do it. And he also stacks the deck in the best way possible. So he's put you in this planet in the exact right place that he feels that you'll be able to best fulfill, using the assets that he's given you, best fulfill your mission and increase your likelihood of getting to heaven. So you're in the most ideal place you could possibly be to end up in heaven. So that's exactly what I would say to answer.
Exactly. So again, this is all part of God's plan. Every bit of it. Is there anything that could possibly occur that God either didn't know of, could not have stopped, and in my argument, must have at least allowed? No, he didn't allow it. He scripted for it to take place. Because in order for him to know the beginning from the end and being an omni God, if there was anything that occurred that he did not agree with or did not want to occur, he's omni. He would have changed it immediately. He chose not to. That shows that he wanted it to happen. And I don't see, okay, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I think, no, I actually, let's go back and let's look at, let me ask you a question, since you're asking me a lot of questions.
Yeah, please, sorry.
Where did love overcome evil? And at the same time, justice and mercy were perfectly reconciled all at once.
Is that from, and just so I'm clear, from my perspective or from what the Bible teaches?
Could be from what the Bible teaches, or it could be from your perspective if you know the Bible.
Well, again, my perspective is that never has occurred but whatever. But that's the death of Jesus is when that took place, according to the Christian worldview anyway.
Excellent. Yeah. So we have that. So we can see what happened in that whole story. So God knew that Judas was going to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him. And so that whole thing played out. Judas was basically evil. He knew that Judas was going to pair up with Satan, and he knew that Judas would betray him. So all of that evil played out. And he also knew, if you look to Jeremiah, he also knew that Judas.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish with Judas.
So I just wanted to say that yes, God knew that. I use a Molinist perspective. I've got the idea that God knows what will happen, what would happen, and what could happen.
Exactly. Right.
So yes, and he stacks the deck accordingly.
Right. And I think there could be a very strong argument made that the hero of the New Testament is Judas. Without Judas, Jesus never would have gone to the cross. Jesus never would have been in front of Pontius. We would have never had salvation. So again, even though it looks like from a outsider's perspective, if you will, that Judas may have been one of the most evil humans to ever live, In fact, he did the greatest of all good by bringing about salvation for all mankind.
So you think that if Judas, you're saying that if Judas is not there, is this, let me get you correct. If Judas was not there, that no other person could have played the same role of the betrayer that Judas did, because you do recall that it wasn't Judas who condemned Jesus to crucifixion. It was Caiaphas and the other high priests.
Exactly.
And actually,
But,
why did they do that? Why did they condemn Jesus to crucifixion? What was their reasoning? Do you remember?
well, the prescribed reason was because of blasphemy and going against whatever. And yeah, I mean, again, maybe you don't, I don't think most people know this. Again, I went to Oral Roberts University. I studied. I'm an ordained minister. I'm fairly up to speed. But again, what I want you to look at is that I didn't ever say that there was no one else that could do it. What I'm saying is, again, that these perceived evils that we would prescribe as evil, as you did to Judas, if we look at them in a different context, and if we look at it from God's perspective, maybe it wouldn't have been Judas. Maybe he could have used someone else. But at the end of the day, the only way, according to at least the Christian doctrine, that we get to salvation is through Jesus on the cross. And that has to occur. So we need someone to effectively push over the first domino. That was Judas. Without Judas, it may have taken longer, it may have been somebody else, but effectively God's will was done, was it not?
Jesus bore that cup. Yes, Jesus bore the cup for our sins. And actually, what's pretty interesting is if you think about that, is you think about how I think Satan was duped, because I don't think that Satan would have actually stepped into Judas and would have played the role he did had he known what was going to happen. His clench on humanity was dismantled. And all throughout the New Testament, Paul and all of the other people who write in the New Testament talk about how basically we were able to get away from the dark powers and break our sins free from chains, not literal chains, but from the chains that were binding us to this world.
Which is exactly what plays to my point, in that God used the evil of Satan, if you will, to bring about the best of goods. Therefore, that evilness, that satanic, horrific character becomes a hero. Satan effectively, through Jesus and through the actions that he made, saved everyone.
See, I think you and I agree with something here. We both agree that God worked, God actually sometimes, and it does say it in Isaiah 45:7, God does use evil sometimes. He does use evil sometimes to make changes. And sometimes when we experience evil, many times we can actually really appreciate what love is. Just like if you experience hatred, you can really come to appreciate what love is. And you can, if you experience injustice, you come to appreciate what justice is. So a lot of times God uses these opposing dimensions to actually grow these very loving, positive aspects of us. And so you think about Jesus hanging on the cross. Just think about this. If you, since you were an ordained minister, which I didn't realize, that's pretty fantastic. Except that you're not anymore, but
well, I just performed. In fact, if you remember Matthew Steele, I just married him and his wife about a month ago. So,
okay.
I'm still, I guess, practicing when I need to. I'll put it that way. So
picture this. Just think about this little idea. So, and I've heard this before. I'm not the first person to originate this idea. I think Michael Brown might have been somebody who said something similar. But think about what people must have thought when they saw Jesus hanging between two criminals on the cross. And Jesus was covered in blood. In fact, he was to the point of being disfigured and unrecognizable, which of course had been portended in Isaiah 52 and 53. But Jesus is hanging on the cross, covered in blood, naked, completely in a way that would be viewed upon very poorly. And the apostles didn't even bury him. They didn't even take him from the cross. Instead, a member of the Sanhedrin, Joseph Arimathea, actually took Jesus off the cross and gave him a proper burial. His apostles were in hiding. They had denied him. Peter denied him 3 times. They were afraid to come out because they thought that they were going to be killed. And so what happened that's pretty fantastic is if someone were standing there in front of Jesus at that point and then could fast forward 2,000 years, who would imagine that the man who is a mere carpenter hanging on a cross covered in blood would actually be the person to whom 2 billion people currently today revere all around the planet? In every country, we have Christians. And in fact, Christianity is the only faith that's not centered around our origin. So it's pretty amazing in that way.
Okay, so again, that means that that awful, horrific suffering that Jesus did for a day, 2 days, 3 days, whatever you want to say, was actually a very, very good thing.
It was. That's what Christians believe.
Okay. So now let's get back to what we were talking about as far as universal good and evil. If we can't take the Son of God and literally torture him and effectively kill him, at least what we would, again, we won't go too far down that road, but you know what I'm saying. Disgrace him, drag him through the streets, make him hang between two criminals. If we cannot categorize something like that as a universal evil, I think you're going to be hard pressed to find a universal evil.
I think we can absolutely categorize that as evil. And in fact, I would say that anyone would objectively agree that a man who's completely innocent, as Jesus was, he was sin-free, for an innocent man to go through that torture, that's the base, the foundation upon which we can say, yes, this is a moral evil. This is wrong. However, God knew that this was the sort of thing that was going to have to be done. And it was in the Old Testament, as you saw, the Passover lamb and the sacrifice and that kind of thing. So it's the idea of fulfillment of the scriptures. And so it had already been, God already knew that this was going to happen.
But again, you just said a minute ago, it was a good. Because, and wait, let me finish.
No, I say God uses evil.
Right. So
God uses evil.
Well, no. Was the death of Christ good?
The death and resurrection of Christ was absolutely the best thing that could possibly happen to all of us on this planet.
Okay, good. And do you think that if God just would have, let's say, allowed him to live to, I don't know, Adam's age of 930 years, if that would have been as powerful as what happened to him at 33 years?
God must have decided that 33 years was the ideal time, or actually it might have been about 37 years. So God must have decided that that was the ideal time.
Okay, so, but again, as horrific as it looks from the outside to us, trying to make that determination is impossible because we aren't omniscient. We do not know all. And God is going to use whatever he can in whatever methodology that he needs to bring about the greatest of all goods. And if God is omnibenevolent, then every action he takes must be the ultimate of all goods. There cannot be half measures with an omni-God. So
I agree. God is omnibenevolent. Everything he does is all good.
And he has literally written the script for humanity. And if that is everything that plays out, including the Holocaust, including 10,000 kids a day dying of starvation, all of that immediately becomes the ultimate of all good because it is prescribed by the ultimate lawgiver and the ultimate good being. You can't have half measures, which again negates all morality. You can't make moral judgments anymore.
One thing that I know you understand, because you said you were a preacher at one point, and so I know you understand this, that we believe the earth is a stepping stone to the next world. And so this life is temporary, and probably I could say that this life is but a speck of sand on the beach compared to the entire beach of heaven. So it could be that we live 2 years or we live 90 years, no matter which it is. Both of those really are in the whole greater scheme of things in eternity are rather minuscule. So whether God allows us to stay on this planet for a couple of months, or he allows us to stay on the planet for a couple of 100 months, or he allows us to stay on the planet 100 years, it's completely up to him. And yes, he uses the goodness of people and he uses the evil of people to shape the world. And as I said earlier, to socially evolve us to get to our objective moral standard in Jesus Christ.
Right. So, I mean, and again, we can get into the soul building. If you want to go down that road, because again, I don't find much merit in that as well, considering we've got an omni-God. If he wanted us to have the soul that we were quote unquote to build, it would be nothing for him to treat us with that soul. I mean, again, we're talking about an omni-God. So the building block method, which you're referring to, which again, being an educator, I use that. In fact, that's one of the main emphasis on part of one of the classes that I teach every semester, is building block methodology. But again, we're dealing with an omni-God. If he wanted us to have the soul, whatever soul we end up with, unless there is another reason that we're not privy to, we could have that soul immediately. All of this extra stuff is a non-issue. But again, and I think we're kind of again straying away from the topic in that I'm still kind of confused on where these omni-bads and omni-goods are, because it seems that every time you bring one up, at least and I think we've done 2 or 3 now, your God has specifically carried those out or ordained they be done, and then you come back by saying, well, God can't. Well, if God can, then it's not universal, because that is at least one person that can do it, which means it's not a universal absolute good or evil.
I think that's where we have a disagreement, because I was trying to make the point earlier that you didn't seem to grasp, I don't think. And I think it's because you don't have the same grasp on what God is that I have. You seem to put him on your same level, as if he's one of us and another human, and is subject to the laws that he's already given us. So no, he's not subject to the laws. He's the one who created the laws, and he created us. And so the idea that God is subject to our universal moral laws that he set for us doesn't make any sense, because he's actually above us, and he can see in the past, present, and future.
No. Let me be clear on this, because
I'll let you respond. Sorry, I just want to let people know we will jump into the Q&A pretty quick here, and I think because we'll do a short Q&A, we probably have to close the question and answer intake. We'll see what we can get to. So if you want to still ask, you can, but it's difficult. And then super chats, I forgot to mention, they go to the top of the list, and they also allow you to make a comment to which one of the speakers can, or both if you want, can respond to. So go ahead, Negation of P. Thanks for letting me cut in, and we'll maybe go about 2 more minutes and then go to the Q&A.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. But now I just lost my train of thought. Oh God, being old is horrible, man. Hey, we were talking. SJ, could you give me your last couple of words, because I'm old and I forget things.
Well, I know I was talking about God's form. So I talked about God being immanent and transcendent, and the idea that he's not subject to the laws. When I speak of universal moral laws, I'm talking about universal across humans.
Okay, well, and I think that's the problem, because if we're going to talk universal, and that's why I specifically asked to begin, universal, if you want it to only encompass humanity, well, then that's by definition subjective. If there's outliers out there, well, I shouldn't say subjective, at least non-universal, which means if...
No, I say all of humanity is subject to these universal moral duties.
Okay, but again, humanity is not all that exists, at least, I mean, number one, I don't believe that either, but I'm assuming you don't believe that, because at least God lies outside that parameter. Therefore, it's not universal. I think for some reason you just don't seem to want to get this. God is not on our level. God is not a person. So I'm saying that God is, and actually when Jesus did come down here, Jesus also was sin-free. So he basically adhered to and obeyed God's moral rules and moral laws and duties. But I want to go back to this idea. So when I say all of humanity, I'm excluding certain groups. I'm excluding all animals. I'm excluding fish. I'm excluding all of these other beings that are on this planet. I'm excluding the ants and the cockroaches and everything else that's walking around. So I'm excluding these other forms of life on this planet, and I'm also excluding what created this planet. So I'm not saying that God is subject to these universal moral laws. I'm saying humanity, all of humanity. Now, whether or not all of humanity actually adheres to the laws, that's a whole nother thing. In fact, Romans 3:23 says we don't. We all fall short of the glory of God. Right. Okay. So let's constrain it to that. Let's work within those parameters. Again, stalemate. Even though I would argue, and I would argue that makes it non-universal. We could have a constrained or a bounded universalism on this end that only encompasses humanity. But even within that bounds, if God ordered someone to kill their child, would it be the right thing to do to kill the child or not?
Again, I tried to make this at the beginning. I tried to make something pretty clear. So God basically manifested as Jesus in the New Testament. And when Jesus came, one of the very first things he said is he came here not to get rid of the law, but to fulfill it. So Jesus himself fulfilled the law. In fact, he also serves as the Sabbath. So that's why when he created the laws that we now adhere to, which were, again, love God and love your neighbors, you notice that the 10 Commandments are only 9 of them are essentially included in that. So you've got the one that's not included, which was the Sabbath, because Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath. And so what I'm trying to say is that when you look at this kind of stuff, I can see you're,
Well,
I'm kind of forgetting my train of thought now too.
Okay, so let's go back. If God ordered you to kill or anyone.
Oh, the baby. Okay, so Jesus, when he fulfilled all of this stuff, going back and trying to take a Christian into the Old Testament and say, well, then how come in this culture God did that? I would make the argument that anything God did in those cultures was culturally specific. So maybe he knew what the potential of the Canaanites was.
That's perfect. That's perfect then. That's perfect.
So wait. Let me just hold on one second.
Go ahead.
So the idea is, as Christians, we're following what we see that Jesus set for us to do in the New Testament. He made very specifically, he said, not only do we have to, in the Old Testament, he talked about enemies. In the New Testament, Jesus said, love your enemies, forgive your enemies. In fact, he says, if you don't forgive your enemies, God might not forgive you. So we have that kind of thing going on. So Jesus called on us to do some very difficult things. And that's why a lot of people don't want to follow Jesus. They don't want to obey his laws because his laws are difficult to follow.
I'm going to give Negation of P just a quick response, and then we got to move to the Q&A just because I don't want to take too much of your guys' time. So Negation of P, if you want to have the last word, and then we'll jump into the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, James. SJ, I think you're missing kind of a big point here in that if it was okay in the Old Testament, but when Jesus came, now it's not, your definition of non-changing does no longer apply. And again, it's conditional. If God tells me to do it, it's okay. If there happens to be this set of circumstances, these people are evil, these people, then we can do these things. That does not speak to a universal moral truth, even bounded by humanity, because humans are the ones that are acting in that instance.
Okay, so we have Mosaic law and we have Messianic law. So we've got two different laws. We've got the laws from the Old Testament and we have the law in the New Testament. And if we go back to the New Testament, if we go to the New Testament and we have the Pharisees talk to Jesus, they said, Jesus condemned people for divorce unless they were cases of sexual immorality. So he condemned divorce. And the Pharisees asked him, they said, well, how about in the Old Testament? Why did Moses say that we could have these divorce documents? And Jesus said, it's because you people you had hardened hearts back then. So there were different rules that applied to people in the Old Testament than in the New Testament.
That's exactly my point.
So
is that
a quick last word, and then we'll have to go to the Q&A.
Okay, so if you don't say anything, because then I might want to say something.
No, he said I could address the last thing you said, and all I'm going to say is you did exactly what I'm saying. You demonstrated that there is a change in the law. There is a change in the quote unquote universal commandments from God. The edicts from God have changed, and which means they cannot be universal by definition, either within or without the bounds of humanity. Which I just said that horrible.
Okay, I disagree, but I know James wants to go to questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't agree with your assessment of what you think is God's moral laws. So.
Okay.
I mean, if you guys want to go longer, like if you're okay with it, I'm okay with it.
I do. I have a big day tomorrow. I've got a long day faculty meeting starting at 8:30. So.
Okay. Thanks for understanding. That's what I was thinking.
We don't start till next week, SJ. So I could stay here all night.
So I appreciate you guys being here. I'm going to try to talk as loud as I can because it's true. My mic right now. So sorry, you guys. I have a new mic. A quality one, like spent over $150. It's coming in the mail because I've gotten so much feedback on how my volume and audio is generally not great, and I promise the mic is coming. Steven Steen, thanks for your super chat. Gosh, he says, where is the James Hidden Cam Patreon tier? Oh my gosh. Oh, Steven's sick. Thanks for your super chat. Brian Stevens, thanks for your super chat. He says, what about the Harena, which have no God concept? I think that's for SJ, if I had to guess.
Who did he say has no God concept?
The Parena, it's spelled P-A-R-A-N-A with an accent mark over the A.
I wish I were familiar with that group. Unfortunately, I'm not. So I really can't answer that. Sorry about that, Brian.
You got it, no problemo. And thanks for your super chat, Think Club. So Adam Brendan, he's been here to debate before and has his own channel of debates, by the way. It's in our description. And he says, SJ, even if there is a best possible moral code, how is this evidence for God? And Ned, well, he's got a question for each of you. So we'll let SJ answer, and then we'll go to Ned.
I think if we go back to Plato's Republic, I think that gives us a pretty good glimpse of the possibilities for the earth. And Plato identified the possibilities as what happens if humanity had been geared towards selfishness and greed? How did we come to these values that we should be good and righteous and forgiving and humble? Where did that come from? We could have easily gone the other way and been selfish. But to me, that must mean that we must have a transcendent moral lawgiver who's righteous and who directs us to these good actions, especially when you can say that the things I identified up front are all focusing on rightness and goodness.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. I'll keep moving fast through these. Ned, the one that Think Club had for you is he asked, how is bad behavior evidence that there is no objective good behavior?
From my perspective, from a naturalistic standpoint, I don't believe that either. I think that there is good. However, I think that the good is based on our goal setting. So whereas SJ was just talking about she didn't see how these could arise or be, let's say, ingrained within us through naturalism, I would say that you could not have had a society that would have gone the way that she was talking about with Plato's Republic to the negative, because that would not have facilitated cooperation, and we are much better as a collective than we are individual. So that's, again, I don't think that there is that badness negates goodness, but I do think there is a natural driver fairly, I would like to get there someday, but yeah, I do think there's natural drivers that would get us there through evolution.
You bet. Thanks so much. And thanks for your super chat. Brian Stevens, he says, and this is like, first he says, why does God show favoritism towards Israel? And then kind of an extension on that, he says, we are all God's children, but God seems to show extreme favoritism towards the nation of Israel. Why would a God of all humanity show favoritism? I think that's probably for us, Shay.
You know, that's a great question, because I'm not sure why God chose the chosen people, but he chose them basically to pave the path for us. And what's interesting is the idea that the stone that the builders rejected turned into the cornerstone. And so many people who are from Israel or Jewish people, some of them have not come to Christianity yet. And so it ended up being the Gentiles who brought Christianity to the levels it's at right now.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, Brian Stevens asked, thanks for your super chat, Brian. He says, if I died when I was 2 years old, would I have gone to heaven? The answer is yes. Wouldn't that be the most ideal situation to get us to heaven?
Yeah, the answer is yes, because it says the kingdom of heaven will belong to those such as these in Matthew. So there's a verse that Jesus makes very clear that the little children are the ones who go to heaven. They basically are innocent. And so, but the reason we're here, and I think that this speaks to the suffering in the world, is we do suffer in the world. Everyone suffers, everyone falls, everyone has hardships. There's not anyone who gets off this earth without having a hard time. But the suffering can be used to build our spirits and our humane orientations. In fact, the places where the most amount of suffering has occurred, places where the most poor, for example, in African countries and places like that, they have the highest levels of humane orientation according to the Globe study. And the one with the lowest levels of humane orientation is West Germany, which I think is kind of shocking. And also East Germany and Spain are in that little group of countries that have the lowest levels of humane orientation. So the bottom line is that a lot of times this suffering might actually build our spirits and make us better people.
Can I come back on that real quick, James?
Yes.
Okay, and again, that would seem to run counter. Number one, if it is soul building, then those children must have been created with their souls built at least the way God wanted them at that point when they died, which means we wouldn't need 60, 80, 100 years to soul build. God can create it that way. And secondarily, there are, I would assume, you're not of the camp that abortion is a good thing, nor, infanticide, in that if the best thing that can happen is avoid the suffering here to get it, for lack of a better term, a free pass to heaven, why do we, again, have this ingrained in this universal, if you will, to borrow your phrase, despise for children being injured and killed at that age? We should
Because
reject
we're not given the right to just go kill children at that age. In fact, I'm completely against abortion. So I think that that's a terrible thing that people do to their babies.
No, I'm saying, why are we not happy? Those children, if those children get a free pass into heaven, you would think that that would be a joyful moment. My son made it. Great. He doesn't have to suffer down here like the rest of us. Thank you. You see?
I'll just answer that real quick, because you probably heard Billy Joel's song, Only the Good Die Young.
Yep.
And I think of my neighbor. I had a neighbor. Now my neighbor, the male neighbor, is now married to my sister, which is pretty neat. But about in 2012, his wife was diagnosed with brain cancer, and she was a very God-fearing, awesome person. She was a second grade teacher. Everyone around her loved her. She was highly disciplined. She did everything right. And suddenly she gets brain cancer and she dies. And why did that happen? And I figure that she completed her mission here and God took her back. And the same thing could be of the little children who are born. Perhaps they had a certain mission and they completed, and so they were going to go back to heaven. And so that's the way I'd answer that.
Gotcha. And next up, thanks for your super chat. We appreciate that from NANA. And I don't know, somebody told me, by the way, if each of you is able to, because my mic is so low, if you're willing to reread, or I should say repeat the question as you answer it until my mic arrives. So NA says, and I don't know if I'm, like, when we get troll chats like this, he says, "Hail Satan." I'm like, should I don't even know if they want me to read it, because some people say it's just awkward. But
it doesn't bother me at all. I like to feed the trolls, and at least back in the day when I was actually playing. So,
gotcha. Well, we appreciate your super chat support, NANA, and then Frank Christian, thanks for your super chat. Frank Christian says Jesus is Lord. So I think they are meaning it sincerely, though. We appreciate your super chat. And Loken16, thanks for your super chat. Says God was so bored he made Lucifer. I don't know for sure if it's. So if you want to respond to it, you can. Otherwise, we will move to the other questions.
Okay, I could see an argument being made for that. But again, I can't see an Omni being getting bored. I actually could. If everything is within your power and there's nothing that you don't know, that would be a very boring existence. The problem is creating Satan wouldn't fix that, because you would know where the plan would end up even before you put it into place. So you're still bored. Maybe you're just kind of, I guess the best scenario would be kind of like watching reruns, because you already know where it's going. You're just going to watch it again. So that's the best I can do with that. I'm sorry.
No problemo, and we'll probably go for just a few questions. I'm so sorry we won't get to all of them, folks. Just wanted to mention that we just wanted to, I want to wrap up on time so that people can get to their meeting. So, really quick, Iron Charioteer, thanks for your question. For SJ, what did God mean when he said, subdue the earth and have dominion over it? Is that an objective law?
Well, subdue the earth and have dominion over it. He spoke of basically that we are on the top of the food chain, for example, with the animals. And so if we want to have beef for dinner, God's perfectly okay with that.
Gotcha. And then, praise I am that I am, for Ned, he wanted to ask, what ontological framework can you provide that accounts for moral oughts?
I don't believe in moral oughts, as I think I made clear. Everything is subjective, and the only framework that I can provide is, I guess the best and most succinct is, everything plays to our goal. And if our goal is to survive as a species, then we will see actions that best facilitate that, being, for lack of a better term, bred for. And that's how evolution works, so to speak. That's where morality comes in a nutshell, from the naturalistic side.
Gotcha. Pants L. Jones appreciates your playful side, negation of P. He said, for negation of P, you seem bitter. Who negated your P? So, appreciate
I'm sorry, I feel bitter. I didn't think I did, but okay. So.
Dragnox Silvas steps in and says, thanks for your super chat, Drag. He says, looking good there, old man. I guess he's...
Tell him when I get down to Houston, we'll see who the old man is.
Awesome. And we will maybe read one or two more here. Sorry, folks, just to respect the speakers' times. We've got Akirez Kizanidi. Thanks for your question. Who asked, what's the difference of one man dying on a cross compared to the countless people that died for not believing in the man on the cross?
Is that for me?
I think so.
Well, I would say of all of the people who walked on the planet, as God said, all fall short of the glory of God. Jesus was the only one who is uniquely positioned because he didn't have any sin to be the Passover lamb, which was, of course, the sinless and blemish-free lamb for our sins, to pay the price, essentially, for our sins. So I endorse different theories on the atonement, but one of them does correspond to the ransom theory.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And last one, just really quick. Mind Onion, thanks for your question. He asked, for SJ, in the book of Luke 11:13, Jesus calls man evil. If we're supposed to think of ourselves as evil, is it still good to love others as ourselves?
Yes, evil is basically a corruption of good. One of the things that separates us from other faiths, especially, say, the pantheist faiths and different faiths like that, is the idea that we don't endorse dualism. Dualism puts evil and good on the same level. And what we're saying in the Christian faith is that God is all good and evil is a corruption. Evil is the attempt by humans in some cases, or by satanic forces, to corrupt good. So evil never is on the same level of good. It's a fall from good. And so we have that whole story play out in Genesis with the fall. And so, unfortunately, yes, we're on enemy occupied territory here in the earth. We do evil things, but I would say we're inherently good, but we do evil actions and we sin. We're all sinners. I think I would probably say that the answer to that is we're all sinners.
Gotcha. Thanks. Negation of P?
I just wanted to point out there that God must want us to sin and must want us to fall short. Again, being an omni being, he either allows it, he must allow it, which means he wants it, which means it becomes the will of God, which no longer would be classified as an evil. I know that's a long way to get there, but it's I don't see how you can get around it. Or
Well,
anybody. I was just speaking to everybody. Sorry, I didn't mean that.
I encourage anyone to please look at Matthew 5 and read the what God says with respect to following His will and obeying His laws and being good. So
I know what He says, but at the same time, we're talking about an omni being. You cannot break His will. There's no way around it.
I agree. We don't break His will.
So it's good. It has to be. If it's not, if it's omni good,
no, His will, God's will is good. A lot of times we fail to live up to it.
We can't fail unless He wants us to fail.
He doesn't want us to fail. So it basically says all throughout Matthew 5 that God wants us to figure out ways to get over our sins and our challenges.
Again, SJ, at least from the temporary standpoint, He must allow it, which means He must want it to happen.
See, I don't agree. Allow and want go in the same sentence like that. If he allows divorce in the Old Testament, did that mean He wanted people to divorce? No, it didn't. God allows slavery. Did it mean He wanted slavery? No, it didn't.
SJ, He is omni. If He didn't want something to happen, it would be less than snapping His fingers. In fact, it makes logical. It's illogical to think of an omni being wanting something to happen and it not happening, or it happening opposite to His will. You can't have that. It is an impossibility.
I think we've done the same argument probably 15 times tonight. So
I agree.
I don't want to.
I'm still confused, and that's why I'm hoping that I can glean something. But anyhow, sorry, go ahead, James.
Want to say thank you so much to our speakers who are linked in the description. So if you enjoyed hearing what they had to say, you can hear more by clicking on those links that are conveniently located below right down there. So with that, I want to say thanks to our speakers for being here. It's just a pleasure to have you both. We appreciate you guys making time for us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. This is great. SJ, great talking to you again.
It's nice talking to you too, Ned. And I know you hit me up back in May, and I put it off as long as I could. And finally, I decided, okay, I'll do it. I'll get back on these debates.
Well, honestly, I'm kind of glad you did, because I changed roles at the college, and it would have been tough if you would have done it much earlier than that. So it worked out well.
It's good.
You bet. And thanks everybody in the audience for your questions and all of your support. Excited about the future. As we mentioned, we have that first in-person debate this Friday, and we have a debate tomorrow that's going to be, one of them is a new speaker we've never had before, and we have plenty more big ones coming up. So, want to say thanks. You bet.
Can I say something really fast? I talked to Inspiring Philosophy, Mike Jones, and he's going to come on my channel next week on Wednesday in the afternoon. We haven't set a time yet, but I just wanted to let the audience know that because I'm really excited.
You bet. Well, that is exciting. Mike's been a blast to watch here as well. So, as mentioned, both Negation of P and Dr. S.J. have their links in the description. And we will see you all next time. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you.
Good night.